So hi everyone, and welcome to the second session of this convening, where we will be talking about the link between forests and climate. But before we begin, I've been asked to share a few logistical notes with you. First, please be sure to join the computer audio and to enable your microphone and cameras if you're prompted. This may depend on the session. If you or a colleague is having trouble accessing the video or audio, please get in touch with Leonor or Nora. Second, if you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please do not hesitate to submit this through the Q&A or chat feature of the Zoom window that appears on the events platform. Otherwise, you can use the feed loop event or direct chat features, and someone from our team will make sure the messages reach the presenters. All of our sessions have simultaneous translation available between English and Bahasa Indonesia. Please select your preferred language by clicking the interpretation icon on the Zoom or stream window and send us a message if you need any help. Finally, we will record all sessions in both languages and post them to FeedLoop within 24 hours after the session ends. Thank you for your patience. So today we have two very distinguished speakers who will help us explore more story ideas at the intersection of forest and climate. We have Mr. Saño, who is the Executive Director of Greenpeace Southeast Asia. He also has experience serving as lead negotiator for the Philippines in the UN climate talks. And today he will be able to share with us more about this issue from the lens of an activist and policymaker. Our other speaker is Dr. Zeng Yiwen from the National University of Singapore's Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Dr. Zeng will be able to share with us more about this issue from the perspective of an academic. And he has also recently published a very interesting paper on the money-making potential of forests in our region, as more countries and companies express interest in carbon credits. But more on that later. So let's hear from the speakers themselves. Perhaps you can just give us.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and a pleasant day to all of our friends who joined us in this webinar. Such an honor to be on this panel. I currently lead the diverse operations of Greenpeace in Southeast Asia, and among our biggest priority issues is deforestation, especially the disappearance of the ancient forests of Indonesia. We all know if we are to solve the climate crisis, the forests of the world, and in particular tropical forests, would play a very important role in averting further damage to the climate, precisely because of the important role that forests play in absorbing further carbon that is being emitted in the atmosphere, and also, of course, all of the ecosystem services that it provides for our society. Greenpeace, as many of you probably know, is one of the world's biggest environmental campaigning organizations, and climate change is one of our priority issues globally. And I'd like everyone to know that Indonesia, Southeast Asia in general, and in Indonesia in particular, is what we consider a priority battleground, meaning that if we lose the battle in saving Indonesia's forests, we're probably not gonna go far in making any headway in addressing the overall climate crisis. So we live in a very important region, and Indonesia sits right there, playing an important role to regulate the overall climate, help regulate the overall climate of the planet, and also, of course, serve the interests of forest dwellers and all people around the world who depend on the resources that come from the forests of Indonesia.
Thank you, Yep, and we will hear more from you later about your work in this area. But before that, Dr. Zeng, maybe you can share a bit more about the work that you do at the center.
Yeah, so thank you, Audrey, and thank you everybody for having me here. I think it's a very exciting opportunity to share some of the things we do. So my name is Yiwen. I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, as Audrey mentioned. I am based in National University of Singapore, as you can see from the picture behind my back. I'm an applied ecologist and conservation scientist by training, and I'm a geospatial analyst. So I basically play around with maps to try to figure out what we can do, what is possible in terms of policy relevant research. So part of what we do here at the center is focusing on producing the science that can inform policy. And I applied this to several different things. One of being the SDGs, which I'm pretty sure a lot of people are familiar with. But one of the main things I'm trying to think about now, or we're trying to figure out here at the center, is to look at nature-based climate solutions. So the idea of using nature to try to solve some of the climate issues we are facing. Yeah, and a big part of what I'm trying to figure out now is how we can try to scale up the implementation of conservation interventions in ways that are financially viable, as Audrey alluded to, but still in ways that are socially and ecologically responsible.
Okay, thank you, Yiwen. So I was hoping that we could, go into detail about 3 of these key areas that you guys mentioned. The first would, of course, be the biology of forests. Yeah, just now you mentioned about how Southeast Asia is like a battleground, and if we don't get things right here in our region, the battle against climate change will be lost. So I think one thing we should talk about is how important forests are in our region to the global climate fight. The second thing is, of course, the changing political significance of forests. I mean, most of us would have known from our schooling days that forests are important because they help to take in carbon dioxide and give us oxygen in return. But why is it that governments now seem so much more interested in talking about this? And lastly, even as you mentioned, the role of communities, how can we ensure that communities are not left out of the discussion whenever we talk about forest conservation? So let's really delve into the first aspect now about the biology of the forest. Yiwen, I mean, from the academics perspective, maybe you can take this. We know that forests take in a lot of carbon dioxide, but what makes tropical forests so special compared to, say, temperate forests, boreal forests? What is the difference?
Yeah, so, well, okay, maybe a little bit of a tiny 101, right? Everybody knows that photosynthesis happens, it takes in sunlight, and then basically forests and trees in particular can convert carbon dioxide to oxygen, water, etc. Basically, what it does is that it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? And store this in terms of trees, within the trees, in the leaf, below ground. So there's several different pools of carbon that we all normally think about. And especially within Southeast Asia, there's usually high volumes of carbon that is being stored. So we tend to think about this in terms of areas like peat swamps or mangrove swamp forests, where they store a lot of carbon actually below the ground within the soils. And that is, well, at least part of the reason why it's very important especially within our region, because we have a lot of this type of habitats that not only host a lot of carbon, but also a lot of biodiversity. So especially as a conservation scientist, we tend to think of things in terms of biodiversity conservation as well. How many species you can protect, etc. And also at the same time, as Yep sort of mentioned earlier, within Southeast Asia, there's always this huge threat of deforestation, right? So the idea is that the carbon that is being locked within the forest is at risk, or is facing the threats of being released to the atmosphere. So instead of having this solution that can actually store carbon to alleviate the amount of, or remove the amount of carbon within the atmosphere, we're instead releasing the carbon to the atmosphere and then further worsening climate change. So I think that's part of the reason why forests within our region especially is very important, because it's undergoing that kind of threat, the kind of imminent threat of being released, right? But at the same time, it's also could be a huge solution to prevent climate change. Yeah.
So that's interesting, because we just had another panel discussion on biodiversity in Southeast Asia. So forests not only take in a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they also provide homes for a lot of wildlife. But we know that threats like poaching, logging is causing damage to species and species abundance. So yeah, maybe I was wondering whether you can talk a bit more about that, considering that Southeast Asia has seen such large tracts of habitat disappearing and also the wildlife in it disappearing. Have we seen any changes in the way the forests are responding in terms of the amount of carbon they can store? I think maybe one perfect example would be Indonesia, right? Like a lot of peatlands there, when they are burned, you see the orangutans getting affected, and you also see them emitting lots of carbon. But I was wondering whether you can share case studies from other parts of Southeast Asia as well.
Yes, thanks very much, Audrey. Well, greenhouse gas emissions, for example, just as a case in point, from the 2015 fires in Indonesia, were estimated at 1.3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. If you want to imagine how that is, that year saw Indonesia become the top carbon emitter in the world, and they exceeded the rate of emissions of the entire American economy on a daily basis. Because Indonesia's fires in 2015 were emitting at a rate of 15 to 20 million tons per day, and the whole American economy, the entire American economy emits 14 million tons a day during that year. So just the fires alone were compromising the ability of Indonesian forests to in fact contribute to carbon sequestration. Um, it's very clear when the fires are burning, then their function as sinks do not really work. So according to so that's more than a billion tons of emissions during that year. And it's quite shocking because the estimates are probably very conservative, even because they account only for the measured greenhouse gas emissions. They don't even include emissions from the oxidation of peatlands, because fires from land and forest fires across Indonesia uh, would uh, would also include emissions from the oxidation of peat. And 2015 was not the only year. These annual fires are contributing to a lot less of the ability of the forest in Indonesia to help in absorbing more carbon from the atmosphere. And I mean, you mentioned if there are other examples from Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, Indonesia is the last remaining really significant forest in Southeast Asia, and there's not a lot of other examples in Southeast Asia that would rival, the problem that we see in Indonesia in terms of scale, in terms of the complexity, because um, that's what's happening across the region. But just collectively, all of the Southeast Asia's forests have become a net carbon source. And when we say a net carbon source, meaning there's not even a single ton of carbon that's being absorbed as a net, because there's more being emitted over the past 2 decades. And this is driven really by degradation of the forest. Widespread clearing is happening all the time. Fires, and what's been striking is how peatlands are being drained deliberately. So peatlands are being blocked, and then they dry up. When they dry up, they even ignite on their own. So that's a very serious problem. But there's some good news around this, because the good news is that this is one source really of global emissions which can quickly be turned around. That's the good news about the issue of forest fires. It can be addressed, and if we acknowledge international responsibility for all of the forces behind the degradation of forests to produce like global commodities such as palm oil, pulp and paper, and other things like coal. We can actually turn this around quite quickly, because we have pinpointed those touch points, those very important for the drivers of nation. Looking at overall, the bad picture, industrial scale degradation that's become so widespread. But we also know that the remaining healthy forests, on the other hand, they do store carbon. And in fact, degraded forest areas, if supported to regenerate, meaning we leave them alone and we allow them to recover, they can also return to being carbon sinks, because that's, as Yiwen explained, growing trees can really soak up a lot of carbon. It's not really too late, for example, to re-wet those peatlands and prevent the carbon that they store from, going up in smoke. So that's the situation in most of Southeast Asia generally, and a lot of that is in Indonesia. And there's also some silver lining to all of this, because Indonesia has already aimed to, as a country, to transform its forest into a carbon sink 9 years from now, by 2030, by taking ambitious steps to reduce deforestation, and also take seriously the reforestation program, and all of this towards Indonesia's aim of becoming carbon neutral by 2070. Of course, these are big promises, big words that are being submitted to the UN process, because a lot of us, even experts, are saying, I'll be interested about Yiwen's view there, how realistic this plan is, given the still current rate of deforestation, and the fact that the prevailing policies still allow for a very, very substantial amount of forest clearing for agriculture. And the elephant in the room is, of course, palm oil, and a surge in palm oil prices globally could also drive further deforestation, which is the world's top producer of the commodity. And palm oil is really central to this issue. We find palm oil in every kitchen, in every bathroom, in all of the stuff that we use. So, if that comes from dirty sources, meaning plantations that have been created out of the destruction of ancient forests, then the problem will continue.
So that is certainly interesting. And from the international community, I think we have seen some encouraging signs from the Indonesian government, like the renewal of the peatland restoration agency. But we'll come back to that in a bit. I just wanted to talk a bit more. I mean, you mentioned mature forests, but we've seen governments worldwide talking about planting trees. So maybe our experts can share with us a bit more today about the difference between monoculture versus a mature forest in carbon sequestration. Who would like to take this?
Maybe I can start, and I'm sure Yep has really good insights here as well. So I think that when we think about nature-based climate solutions, there are several different categories or bins we can think about. One of it is forest protection. So like what Yep was talking about earlier, where, let's say Indonesia, or actually across entire Southeast Asia, right? A lot of the forests are turning from sinks into sources, so they're releasing carbon dioxide. If we halt the land degradation, we halt the cutting down of forests for agriculture, right? The idea is that the protection of forests itself can become a way to mitigate climate change, because you're stopping that release from the forest itself. So that's one. Another one is what you alluded to, Audrey, which is the planting of trees, so reforestation. But reforestation is quite complex in itself as well. There are several different types of reforestation. The simplest one is, like, for example, planting of things like acacia or eucalyptus. It can grow really fast, so you can gather carbon really fast, but ecologically, it's slightly less meaningful, and it doesn't provide the same kind of benefits to people or to biodiversity around as well. And then there's the other more complex one, which is around land management. So then that means changing agriculture practices, right? Like to have more sustainable use of the land for crops, like maybe, agroforestry, where you plant several different types of crops together as well. So these are all some of the different strategies that could be involved, and they all have different trade-offs in terms of the benefits it can provide to the people around, how fast it can soak up carbon. And I think these are some of the things that people or scientists like us tend to try to wrap our head around and figure out which strategy is best for which location. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to chime in? I was wondering if you can talk about whether, for Greenpeace, have you guys seen the effects of monoculture or the planting of a singular species, and how that has impacted the ecosystem?
Yes, absolutely agree with you and on the impact of monoculture plantations, not just from a reforestation perspective, but in general. In any plantation that is monoculture does not restore the health of the forest, and this is where nature-based solutions as a concept tries to address this problem, because nature-based solutions, the concept itself is about conserving nature, not for the sake of nature per se, but conserving nature so that people, from that particular measure of conserving uh, the forest. And they would play a very important role in, of course, helping tackle climate change. Why? Because we know that most of the limelight for many years has been on planting trees in a monoculture way for carbon sequestration, and even for that, it doesn't really work. And often trees that are part of commercial plantation even involve non-native, invasive species that really has very little benefit for biodiversity, because that's the calculus or logic of it. When you go into monoculture plantation, you go for the biggest value for money, and often that's cheap species that are invasive. And the expansion of forestry framed as a climate change mitigation solution. I mean, in principle, that's important. We need to restore forest as part of mitigation, but it's been for the longest time been hyped too much and been used for greenwashing by corporations, and also as an excuse for not paying attention to the issue of fossil fuels. So although it's really vital to protect uh, a very diverse mix of carbon-rich and native ecosystems that are diverse, that has great biodiversity, including old-growth forest, natural grasslands, as well as wetlands. Even for the work that we do in Greenpeace, we know there is a limit to the carbon that can be stored by trees that are just merely newly planted. And as well, there are issues around permanence, around whether this is additional to what would have been sequestered if the forests were not even touched. So this kind of sequestered carbon will not be permanent. It is at risk of being leaked back into the atmosphere, especially in countries where enforcement of forest laws are very, very weak, because they will, and also plantations tend to be harvested immediately. So, and then again, going back to the issue that in many parts of Southeast Asia and in Indonesia in particular, many plantations, even plantations, are very prone to fires. And once they go up in smoke, then the permanence of such sequestered carbon become a very, very serious issue. After all, they contribute nothing to solving climate change. Now, one particular emphasis we also want to make when we talk about nature-based solutions is because this is not just about being nature-based, but most of the nature-based solutions projects that we have seen are being designed and implemented with a lot of community empowerment in mind, and they involve a lot of partnerships with local communities, and ultimately the central to nature-based solution projects is equitable sharing of benefits that are derived from forests and any other natural resource. So we have seen a lot of projects that have been badly designed. They ignore the rights of local people. They undermine the tenure of forest dwellers, as well as their right to actually manage their own resources, and undermine the legitimacy, as well as the viability of these initiatives. So that's that's the experience we've had around. I've addressed monocrop plantations and all the way to the problems with projects in reforestation.
So before we move on to the next part about political significance of forests and how they have changed over time, I would like to invite Yep and Yiwen to think about this question that I just received in our Q&A box, which is whether you guys can provide any examples of positive forest restoration or forest conservation projects in our region that has benefited climate, community, biodiversity. I mean, personally, from my reporting experience, I have been to this project in Indonesia called Katingan Mentaya, where when it's a conservation of a peat forest, and the community seems really involved. Alternative livelihoods are provided for them, and a market is provided for them to sell their alternative crops. But I would like to invite the panelists to think about this, and I'll circle back to this question at the end. But let's move on now to our second part of today's discussion on the changing political significance. So we know at the end of this year, in November, countries will be gathering in Glasgow to talk about Article 6, which is about the establishment of global carbon markets. So maybe, you were a lead negotiator for the Philippines once. Do you think the discussion or the creation of a global carbon market is spurring governments to think about how they can conserve the forest on their land so that it could be a potential source of carbon credits?
Yes, the Article 6 discussion in the climate negotiations truly has spurred a lot of excitement around the topic for carbon markets. But I wouldn't hold my breath with that, because we've tried that many times in the past. But of course, it's ideal. I mean, carbon markets is seen as a driver for climate solutions. But personally, and even with Greenpeace, we're very cautious around carbon markets that involve forests, because that would mean offsets, and offsets are, of course, merely an excuse as well to continue polluting domestically for many countries that have high emissions. So we have to look at this with a lot of caution, and towards COP26. Of course, the view is that if you have a robust carbon market, it drives up the price of carbon, and then we're able to regulate emissions more effectively across the world. Now that cannot happen in a vacuum. That needs to go hand in hand with many other solutions, including, of course, a rapid transition away from fossil fuels, and the carbon market alone, if we're looking at an offset market, we know that under the Kyoto Protocol that failed big time, and if we rely on the market to solve the climate change, which is a result of market failure, then we're really allowing history to repeat itself in a bad way. And I'm observing from a distance. I'm no longer involved in the negotiations, but I do see how the same arguments are being recycled, and in Article 6 in particular is basically a rehash of the old carbon markets negotiations and conversations. I'm particularly nonetheless particularly thrilled to see how nature-based solutions as well were on a big topic in Davos in February, and continues to be a major theme of COP26. So if we would refocus to that instead of a lot of excitement around new carbon markets, I think we would be we would be benefiting more from that focus rather than from carbon markets. When I negotiated on the Kyoto Protocol, I always saw carbon markets as a scapegoat to genuine and ambitious climate action, and that's the reason why the Kyoto Protocol died a quick death, and we don't want the Paris Agreement to suffer the same fate.
Thanks, yeah. And I guess it's a good reminder for journalists covering this issue that carbon credits should not be a replacement for climate mitigation, which is to get governments and companies to reduce emissions in the first place. We will come back to that because that seems like a huge bone of contention in global discussions. But even earlier I mentioned about your newest study and how it plotted out tropical rainforests in the entire world, which is the three rainforest basins, and it seems like our region has large potential for forest conservation projects. So I was wondering whether you can maybe share with the journalists here a bit more about your findings, and also respond a bit to what Yip said about will this be deflecting attention away from carbon mitigation?
Yeah, for sure. So I completely agree with you. I think there's this general perception that if I, let's say if I'm a company or government and I am, investing or buying carbon credits somehow, it's an excuse for me to, or that could be viewed as an excuse to continue to not decarbonize as quickly, right? So, but at the same time, I think that, across the world, we are seeing a lot more companies, a lot more governments that are trying to rapidly decarbonize. They have all these net zero goals, all these carbon neutral goals, right? So, and there's a maximum that they can achieve. And I think this is where, carbon markets and nature-based climate solutions especially can come in, right? Because once you reach a maximum, you have to make it up by, reforesting, for example. And when you looked at one of this, we looked at forest protection particularly as a nature-based climate solution and how it feeds back into carbon financing. One of the things we found was that, so Southeast Asia, if we protect forests, Asia Pacific, if we protect all the forests here and prevent it from further deforestation, the idea is that it will mitigate climate change by up to 800 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. This is based on some modeling of the carbon stocks that are locked in the forest currently, right? Both above and below ground. And what we also found is that if we apply really simple rudimentary assumptions of what the carbon markets, right, could look like, the carbon financing scheme could look like, we find that within Asia Pacific, this amounts to about $24 billion a year in terms of returns on investment. So this has the potential to generate a lot of returns. So technically, if we convert a lot of the forests currently into carbon projects, it has the potential to be financially viable, right? And the idea is that some of this money, at least in theory, can flow down to all the various stakeholders involved in this process. But of course, I'm always very wary about this sort of things because there's a lot of projects out there that have a history or are known to not be very well run, or it's not equitable, or even though they promise certain biodiversity benefits or certain benefits, it might not actually be realistic. And I think that's the complexity of a lot of these nature-based solutions, because it's happening in the forest far away from the people who are actually buying the credits. So they don't have the ability to really see what's going on and judge for themselves if it's really coming true. And of course, a lot of this involves really hard work, like of especially the auditing process of actually talking to people and figuring out what is going on the ground. And I think maybe this is part of the contributing factors to why, like Yip mentioned, some of the projects, or maybe even a lot of the projects, are not particularly well run as well. Yeah.
So this discussion is interesting, and I think we can talk a bit more about it since it's going to be super relevant in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow. But one thing that I've heard from when I was speaking to Yiwen's colleague in NUS, Professor Koh Lian Pin, he was sharing that if you look at what is driving climate change today, of course, majority of it is driven by people burning fossil fuels, right, for energy. So that's a main driver, and no amount of carbon credit should be able to reduce the impetus to try to reduce that source of credits, that source of emissions. But deforestation is also another huge driver of climate change, right? When you release all the carbon locked in our mature forests. So he did say that, if you put the correct price of carbon, you set the right price of carbon, you ensure that, you fulfill all these other criteria about making sure that the projects are well run, you could, in a way, make forest conservation now more profitable than clearing the land for palm oil or acacia plant or pulp and paper. So I was just wondering whether the two of you would talk a bit more about that. Do you agree? Do you think that carbon credits or nature-based solutions could actually create a market for forest conservation, which was previously thought to be not profitable at all?
Yeah, so this is where I think a lot of my, at least some of the research we do here at the center really comes in, or at least a big part of the focus, because in terms of climate mitigation, right, it has a lot of potential. Nature-based climate solutions, forest protection, for example, it has a lot of potential, not just in being cost efficient, it has the potential to generate co-benefits, which can, provide people with, pollinators for you can support water regulation, nutrient regulation, so it can offset some of the pollution caused by excess. There's a potential to protect biodiversity. There's all these, and of course for mangrove forests, there's always storm protections, storm surge protections, for example, wave attenuation. So there's all these benefits, and technically, we should be able to stack or package some of these together to command a higher price in carbon. So the idea is that if we really start to think about this properly and properly quantify some of these co-benefits and benefits to people and the climate, etc., there is a potential to command a higher price, which could then offset what will otherwise be the opportunity cost in terms of agricultural land development. So there's this huge potential, but then there comes the other side of the coin where there's all these other potential drawbacks or trade-offs, and whether or not we can actually, I guess, get people to want to protect all these land area. And I think that's where, I guess, the forefront of it is, right? We're trying to figure out a lot of people are trying to figure out what they can do with their land and whether or not it is worthwhile getting involved in nature-based climate solutions. Yeah.
Okay, food for thought, huh? Well, we keep the questions coming, guys, if any. I was wondering now whether we can move on to the next segment about communities. I think a few observers in this climate nature-based solutions scene have commented that whenever we talk about forest conservation, forest preservation, it's very important to involve the communities in them. So maybe now we could invite you guys to think a bit more about the first question that was raised. Sorry, I on my screen it seems that it was a question from someone who's anonymous, but please let me know if it's you. Yeah, but maybe or Yiwen, you can share a bit more about whether you guys have any positive examples, because in journalism we do try to do solutions journalism, and other than the doom and gloom, we do want to offer people some positive examples that could serve as a benchmark or could serve as an inspiration. Maybe you can share with us a bit more from your perspective.
Yes, I'd like to mention the example of the work that Greenpeace does in Papua. As we know, Papua's forests are the largest remaining intact forest in Indonesia. And it's blessed with such amazing flora and fauna. And there's, in fact, very high endemism, and some are even being discovered. New species are even being discovered recently. And apart from being a biodiversity haven, we also know Papua is home to hundreds of indigenous peoples communities. We've documented at least more than 270 tribal communities, and they live scattered from all the way from coastal areas up to the interior of Papua, deep in the heart of the Papuan forest wilderness. And their lives are so connected to the forest, and the forest serve as their food barn. It also serves as their pharmacy, and it's also the primary thing that shapes their culture. Meanwhile, then forest destruction due to all of the things we already know, like mining, logging, palm oil plantations is increasingly really spreading in many places around Papua, and I've seen this with my own eyes when we went there. It is heartbreaking because it is affecting Papua in very serious ways, and all of the indigenous communities, their lives are increasingly being marginalized. Now you're asking us about uh, positive stories around this because I'm laying down some of the context because the reason why we work there, the reason why we work with communities is because we believe that if the forest destruction there is allowed to continue, it will certainly have uh, very adverse major impacts both on those communities on the whole of Indonesia and the entire planet because of its implications on further disruption of the climate, of biodiversity, and also of their livelihoods. And so we have been involved in developing community-based forest management because we believe that it serves as a very robust basis both of community development that redounds to economic benefit as well as protection of human rights of the community rights in the form of acknowledging, for example, indigenous forest areas. Can it be a solid and clear answer to how indigenous peoples could live and protect the forests? And that's not even a surprise. A lot of us who have been working on forest issues, we have known that for decades. But this approach has been running, as I said, many decades ago, working with the kind of Saño tribe in South Sorong in Papua. We have been using the approach with the community, and they not only are able to transform the initiative of forest protection, but they also get to manage to get economic benefits from non-timber forest products, for instance, such as the production of rattan, sagu, and damar resin, which they do very well. And we also try to strengthen the governance policy with by working with these communities because after all they are major stakeholders in this issue and working with indigenous communities to prevent their forest from being cleared. They really play an important role both in terms of influencing policy at the provincial government in Papua as well as the national government. So that's for me a very crucial piece of the role. That's why we have our solutions, what we call our solutions projects involving forestry and forest communities. For us, because it's the last bastion of ancient forests in Southeast Asia and in the world. Actually, it's really important that um, we 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 involve the community there and then we work closely with them.
So yeah, I think one thing that you said earlier about how the forest was the pharmacy, the fruit barn for communities there provides such powerful imagery because I mean I'm from Singapore, but I think I speak for many city dwellers when they talk about these kind of things about being a food source, they don't think about the forest. So maybe you can share with us more anecdotes. Journalists really like examples. Share with us more about how communities are using nature. I mean, for these communities, they are probably not thinking about how forests are good for climate, right? They're probably experiencing firsthand the effects of forests, whether it be mangroves. Just now, Yiwen talked about mangroves being adaptation. And we know that Philippines is one country that is very susceptible to typhoons. So maybe you can share with us some examples from the Philippines about whether, have there been anecdotes of nature-based solutions actually providing protection to coastal communities?
Oh, absolutely. We all know that the Philippines is visited by many intense typhoons on a yearly basis. In fact, about 20 typhoons a year. And I have worked. We have worked with many communities that have gone to restore their mangrove forest, and many of these communities that have done that have been spared by the damage brought about by typhoons. Very similar to the protection offered by mangrove forests during the 2004 tsunami. So there's a lot of those stories. I mean, you ask about anecdotes, and whether it's in northern Philippines uh, or in the southern part of the Philippines and in the western part in Palawan province. We do not run out of these stories, and not just stories, they're actually documented cases of mangrove forests being able to provide uh, coastal protection, not just from ordinary coastal hazards, but also hazards brought about by extreme weather because of climate change. So it's a very mutual benefit there, and of course, the larger benefit of mangroves is how they provide for people's livelihoods, being also the breeding ground for fish and many other species. Being in Southeast Asia, of course, tourism provides a very big benefit for areas where you have mangrove forests intact and also restored. I have a real wonderful opportunity to have worked with many communities that have been very strong in mangrove protection, but also mangrove restoration. And on the other hand, there are also many communities because that have lost that opportunity. I've seen so many communities having to suffer from hazards because they have taken their mangrove forest for granted, and the Philippines has lost more than 50% of its original mangrove forest stands, and you can just imagine how much of that has been lost already, and it continues to decline very rapidly. I think the same is happening in many parts of Indonesia and Southeast Asia.
So maybe we can talk a bit more about the effects on communities. Yeah, ahead of COP24 in Katowice, you fasted for 2 weeks to pray for the Philippines after the impacts of Typhoon Haiyan. So maybe tell us more about the experience. What was it like in the Philippines? What were the impacts like that prompted you to undertake this endeavor?
Thanks, Audrey. That was actually in 2013, before COP19 in Warsaw, and that super typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. I was in Poland also in 2018, just uh, to reminisce that moment. But yeah, it was very personal to me because super typhoon Haiyan made landfall in my family's hometown, and I have a lot of relatives there, a lot of friends, and we did lose a lot of friends and relatives, with 10,000 people dying when the typhoon hit Tacloban City. My brother survived the typhoon, but he has spent many days helping gather bodies of the dead. And I know we're engaging in a conversation today with journalists listening, and for me that was it was very striking, and I like telling this story because it humanizes the climate issue. Um, and it was striking for me because my brother remembers exactly to this day how many dead bodies he held in his hands. And that's an experience that someone dear to me and had to go through. But many people around the world go through something like that, whether it's people having to suffer because of more intense weather events, like the flash floods that's happening right now in many parts of Europe, in North America, in Africa, and the heat waves as well that's spreading in many parts of the world as we speak. Um, and for me, it really is profound because these are real people, real livelihoods. And the reason why I decided not to eat during that conference is my brother was not eating anything, and many other people I know couldn't find food to eat after the typhoon, left a wake of massive devastation, and also a lot of social unrest immediately following the typhoon. So it was an act of solidarity with them, an act of paying homage to not just Filipinos affected by that specific typhoon, but everyone else across Southeast Asia, across um, Africa, Latin America, and everywhere else whose lives are being affected severely by the climate crisis, including, of course, uh, people who are supposed to benefit from forests, because that's our topic today. But instead of benefiting from forests, um, they lose their rights, and in turn they suffer as well. So I I'm mindful that I did that in the context of being a climate diplomat, and normally that's going really way beyond the the protocols of diplomatic setting. But I had to do something. I didn't want to be a cog in a machine, knowing how profound the impacts of climate change is for many people around the world. And I was thinking about many communities affected. And as I always say, this battle will not be won or lost in those plenary halls. They won't be won or lost in the chambers of law or chambers of commerce. They will be won or lost at the grassroots. The people who are poor and marginalized are the ones who are gonna be at the receiving end of this, and therefore it's important to really to know that we are to realize that this battle will have to be won or lost in the chambers of people's hearts, and standing in solidarity is one way of being able to accomplish that.
Thank you, Yep. And yeah, thanks for sharing your personal story with us. I mean, for us as communicators, I mean, experiences like this really show that we need to put humans really front and center. In Southeast Asia, our region is home to one of the most vulnerable communities in the world. So we have to remember, I mean, that is the ultimate aim, right? To protect our neighbors, right? The people we share our region with. So that is really a sobering reminder for many of us. So I guess maybe I will leave that and we can open up floor. Just thinking about the biology of forests, how the changing significance of forests, and also about how communities are central to not only their conservation, but also in terms of us reducing the harshest impacts of climate change to protect these communities. But maybe I'll kickstart the question with one by SL Wong from Makaranga. She asks, has COVID-19, particularly in economies which continue to be ravaged by the pandemic, impacted the attractiveness? So maybe you talk about this, since I think this might be related to the fluctuating carbon prices as well.
Yeah. So I think every market or every economy sort of has its own strategies, especially after COVID-19. The good thing that I think we are seeing now is that as part of many countries' post-pandemic plans, there is an increased focus on a green economy, right? Finding ways to try to come out of this stronger and come out of this with maybe a more ethical and more environmentally friendly direction, right? And I think along with this, there has been an increased attention, right? Increased investments towards nature-based climate solutions. And I think, especially within the realm of people who actually work on a lot of these, carbon projects, nature-based carbon projects, that there has been a rise or increasing interest and increasing amount of money that has actually been coming towards nature-based climate solutions. So this actually sort of affects the price, and it also affects the volume that's being traded. And I think being slightly more optimistic, it is going up in an upward trajectory. So yeah, I think in general, I think there is more attention and more interest in it, and I think this is very promising. Yeah.
Thanks, Yiwen. I think we have a question from Asyanti who has her hand raised. I'm not sure, Nora, if we could unmute. Hi, Asyanti. Okay, maybe I'll move on to the next question first. We have another one in the chat, and the question is, what are the impacts of climate change on small islands west of Sumatra, such as in the Mentawai Islands? People living on the coast during the dry season have difficulty getting clean water from wells and creeks, while people in the middle of the island with better forests still have clean water sources. Is this the impact of climate change or the impact of the reduced amount of forest on the islands? Oh, that's such an interesting question. Who would like to take this? Maybe you, since you went to the previous one, yep, you could take a stab at this.
Yes. So thanks for that question. My disclaimer is that I'm not familiar with that geographic area, but my answer would be based on general impacts of climate change, together with other reasons for the decline of water resources, freshwater sources, and climate change is a major factor here because we know that the sea level is also rising, and when the sea level rises, even gradually, it can contribute to to compromising the freshwater aquifers of islands, and if that happens, then your freshwater is seriously affected. And then if you combine that with deforestation, which is supposed to protect your watershed, then you have that lethal combination. You would just have those factors combining to give you that would result in the severe decline of your freshwater resource. And then you do have other things like groundwater extraction that can cause subsidence, as well as coastal development that could contaminate your freshwater sources. So, I mean, freshwater hydrology is a complex cycle, but if we want to simplify it, basically, the hydrologic cycle allows precipitation uh, uh, to, to drop on land, so in the form of rain, mostly for tropical areas. And if you do not have sufficient basin to absorb that, or to capture that, then you lose that water that flows all the way to the ocean, and or contaminated by human activity. So you, in essence, because the amount of fresh water in the entire world is constant, every time it goes into the ocean or gets contaminated, we have less and less water to provide for our needs, whether you are in a big country or on a small island. But small islands are particularly more vulnerable to this, precisely because of saltwater intrusion as a major factor.
That is a very interesting question and a really interesting answer, because I think recently we have all seen like reports about how the Amazon is losing its ability to cycle its own water because of deforestation and logging. So it is an interesting question. It is something to ponder about how Southeast Asia, which has considerably different geography from the Amazon, would be impacted. So probably a story idea for our journalists here. Okay, we have another question. Before I take that, I want to ask Asyanti whether you would like to ask our question, because the hand is still raised. Okay, never mind. We'll move on to the next one first, and we'll come back to Asyanti. The other question is, I'm curious to hear impressions from a researcher and practitioner or leader, if you have any examples of working well with journalists in campaigns or in communicating key findings of your work. So, Yiwen, I mean, since you're talking about from a researcher's perspective, you would like to take this.
Sure. I think, well, it's a bit funny because Audrey's here. So We tend to, well, at least at the center, we tend to always like to communicate our research. I think it's part of the whole idea of why we're doing this research to begin with. A big part of it is trying to produce the science that is policy relevant. So to be able to inform people, and not just governments or companies, but actually across a whole wide range of stakeholders. And I think this is why we tend to try to work with a lot of reporters, a lot of journalists, and try to get the information out there. The whole idea is about open science, right? If we don't have the open science, research will not progress at the speed that it needs to progress at right now, right, in order to deal with climate change. And I think, like what a lot of us were saying earlier, the idea is that this whole thing needs to be a grassroots movement. It needs to go into people's minds to get people to want to change, right? It all starts with the people thinking that climate change is important and dealing with climate is important, and preserving the forests to achieve that is important. So if we can communicate that, I mean, the whole idea is we can't communicate that without the help of journalists, of course.
Yeah, what about you? Would you be able to share from the activist group's perspective about challenges communicating your work?
Yes, well, I'll start with some positive things. Greenpeace has always relied on our partnership with the media to do our work. We use the ideal model in Greenpeace. I stands for investigate, and our work with the media has gone a long way from the beginnings of Greenpeace. 50 years ago, we're celebrating our 50th year this year, and in Southeast Asia, we have been working here for 20 years. And a lot of the investigations we've done, whether it's on forests or corruption involving the coal industry, and not just in Indonesia, of course, our climate justice work in the Philippines, working with climate impacted communities. Our media partners, journalist partners, have always been there to help spread the message, as well as the now the more popular plastics pollution issue. I mean, we've always had a good relationship with the media, and I said ideal. D is for document, and in documenting all of these things, we always bring media with us to witness and to bear witness to environmental crimes, to the impacts of environmental abuse, and many other aspects of the whole spectrum of our activism work. E stands for expose. So once we have investigated and documented, the biggest work we have with journalists is when we expose things, right? So when we expose, for example, collusion between government and corporations involving a particular environmental issue, or corruption involving certain sectors, or even just the plain, the plain the plain fact that peatlands are being dried up so that they go up in smoke. We expose that through our media partners. And then A stands for actions, and that's where you see Greenpeace hang banners and try to stop illegally cut logs or shipments of dirty palm oil. That is where we also bring our friends from the media to witness that and document that. And L is stands for lobbying. That's where we then use all of those things that we've worked with the media to influence policy, and it has been very successful in many of our campaigns, whether that's on forests and our big work on what we call our transparency work in the forest. We call it the forest transparency work because we know that we have to look at the root causes and the power dynamics that drive forest loss. So our transparency work, we've worked with, of course, not just mainstream traditional media, but also with citizen journalists. So that's something we have been doing for many years, and we have benefited so greatly from that synergy.
Thank you, Yep. So I'm going to open the floor for one last call for questions. And while waiting for people to send in questions, I think I have a follow-up from that last question about how you guys are interacting with the media. Is there any one issue that you guys feel has been undercovered, of whether it's from the academics perspective or from the activist perspective? Do you think, for example, media should do more about community efforts, ground up methods? Or should we talk a bit more about, should we provide more nuance when covering carbon credits from nature-based solutions? Should we also include the fact that, credits should not affect mitigation efforts? What do you think are gaps that journalists can report more on forests in our region? Maybe, yeah, you can. Oh, Yiwen, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, maybe a really quick one for me. I think there has been a lot of interest in protecting the forests, especially for the climate, for reforestation, especially over the past couple of more than that, past few years, right? There's been a lot of interest from the media, from journalists, which is fantastic, because I think the whole trajectory of where this is going, and a lot of attention towards the carbon markets. There's been some recent reporting on some of the issues around carbon accounting and carbon reporting. So I think that's really interesting and very important as well. Basically, covering some of the things we talked about today, which is basically the difficulty in trying to scale up some of these nature-based climate solutions, as well as some of the issues, direct issues that it can cause to the communities and the different stakeholders that basically live around and really experience the effects of these solutions. Yeah.
So what I would contribute to that question is, and we're still talking about forests here. I think it's really important to look at transparency, not just from the government side, but also the disclosure that's happening in the corporate sector. And many companies have in fact made promises. They have created internal policies for their supply chains. So we need to hold them accountable, and it would really be good for journalists to look into that, because those remain unreported logically, because they are in fact deliberately not being disclosed and being hidden. And one of the things that we've been struggling with, for example, is information of concessionaires. Concessionaire information in the forest areas is not a public it's not public information, and until that becomes public information, that will continue to drive deforestation because no one is accountable. So there's a lot of corruption that's happening, and I'm sure that's an very attractive topic for many journalists. Of course, also a dangerous topic, um, and it would be really great also to see, our friends, journalist friends, making, for example, freedom of information requests to the government on forest issues, rather than just simply asking for comments from officials. Because if you ask for specific documents, progress reports through a freedom of information request, you could receive more detailed information instead of just really hearing what the government has to say about the issue. It takes time, perseverance, to obtain that information that they will normally will not be keen to make public. And but ultimately there are laws in many countries that promote transparency, so we want to encourage that. Maybe the last point on this question is, we've seen a lot of land banking happening, especially in Indonesia. So while there's a lot of talk about agrarian reform, a lot of oligarchs are amassing concessions in many huge areas of forest that, of course, they will use later on for plantations and other extractive industries. But these are very well connected people, and they're going to influence those regulations in the future that aim to manage land, and they would in fact continue to capture that power. So that's one particular area that we do need help on, but also I think would be a particularly interesting area to look at. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Yep and Yiwen. And it seems that we do not have any more questions, but I guess what you guys ended off would be a good time to plug our sessions next week, which would be about investigative journalism and how journalists can go about finding data for their stories. So if there's any more questions that you guys did not manage to ask or think about later, you can always contact our speakers through FeedLoop. And yeah, we'll see you guys soon. Stay tuned for the session tomorrow where we talk about how journalists are exploring stories at the intersection of forest and climate. So thank you to both our speakers and to all our participants today, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yiwen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and stay safe, everyone. Take care.
Yes, you too.
You too.
Well done, Audrey. Great questions.
Yes.